Today's daf we're going to be learning is Sotah daf Lamed. Today's daf is sponsored by Jerry Goldstein Gedalia and Harris Gedalia in honor of Eliraz Levant on his bar mitzvah Shabbat Acharei Mot Kedoshim. We're so proud of you. Today's daf is sponsored by Raquel Lifshitz Pilzer and Jen Lifshitz Lankin in loving memory of their brother Avigdor Chai Avraham Zichrono Livracha on his second year at site. Your incredible strength, bravery, and laugh will always be with us. You're always in our hearts and on our minds. We miss you dearly and hope to continue to learn in your merit and make you proud. Okay, we're going to get started and continue. I'll review a little bit of the Tum'ah v'Tahara that we've been learning, the laws of impurity. A bit complicated. My strong recommendation to those who really feel like they want to understand this properly is just to review the daf one or two more times. As you go through it a second or third time, it'll start. You'll see the improvement from time to time, right? It's one of the best ways to learn Gemara is after you learn it, you review it again and review it again. I know you don't have time for that, which is okay also, especially in daf Yomi context, but you'll see that when you look at a sugya first and it looks very complicated, when you read it a second time, it's more clear. When you read it a third time, it even becomes more clear. So just to review, we started with the statement of Rabbi Yoshua that said, I wish, right, we understood Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, he used to write that, I wish I could show him this pasuk of Rabbi Akiva, because he was always worried that people were going to say that a sheni is not mitamei shlishi. And even though Rabbi Akiva was talking about sheni being mitamei shlishi, even in chulin, Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai seems to be worried that a later generation is going to come and say a sheni isn't even mitamei shlishi when it comes to truma. And that's why all Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, the source we're bringing for him is about truma. And then what we did was we brought what was his logic if he didn't have a pasuk, and the answer was he had a vachomer. Okay, and then we questioned that vachomer, and then we strengthened it and said, no, the vachomer really stands. And again, this vachomer was, if you remember from yesterday, if you have a tvul yom who can eat chulin, then if you have a tvul yom who can eat chulin, who's permitted to chulin, by the way, what does it mean he can eat chulin? It actually means two things. It means he can eat regular food, which is chulin. It means a tvul yom also, remember, what can't a tvul yom eat? Truma. It also means he can eat maser sheni, which is considered chulin. Many of the commentaries here say that the chulin is maser sheni, the second time, which is what you're supposed to bring to Jerusalem and eat there, that's treated like chulin, and a tvul yom is allowed to eat that. So a tvul yom can eat that, and yet can't eat truma. So a kikar sheni, a sheni lituma, which is disqualified in chulin, ain't meaning, right? It's a problem, right? Meaning Rishon passes on truma to second degree impurity to chulin, so regular items. So obviously, if the tvul yom is much of a chulin and possible truma, obviously something which is possible chulin is going to also be a shlishi, right? It's going to pass on shlishi, the truma. So that's how we get that there's shlishi in the case of truma. And then, right, we tried to question it. We strengthened the vachomer of the tvul yom by combining it with the klicheres, and then we basically said from each side has its tzad kamor, but we figured that. Then we moved on to Rabbi Yosi. Rabbi Yosi said, "Minayin l'revi'i b'kodesh pasul." How do we know that a revi'i b'kodesh is pasul? Okay, it's the same kind of question as shlishi b'truma, revi'i b'kodesh. Again, I want to just review all these laws just so you really understand them well. Right? Remember, we have in avatuma, let's say that's a zav, a zavar, or like that, or a person who became in contact with a dead body, or a sheret. They pass on impurity to a rishon. A rishon passes on to a sheni. Okay, we've already discussed what, right? The first is to food and people, to food vessels and people. That's a rishon. You can pass on to a rishon. A rishon can only pass on to food. Only food can become a sheni. Then food can pass on to a shlishi only if it's truma or kodshim, right? Except for Rabbi Akiva, who thinks even chulin. And revi'i is only by kodshim, by sacrificial items. Okay. And the language used in the Gemara, I want to also stress this also, there was a lot to say yesterday, so I didn't say this yesterday, but I'll start with it today, which is if you notice there's a language, sometimes it says litameh and sometimes it says lifsol. Lifsol always means the end game. So if you're talking about truma, a shlishi, you're going to say lifsol because that's it. It doesn't go farther than that. If you're talking about a shlishi for kodshim, you're going to say mitameh because it makes it tameh and it could still pass on impurity one more degree. So when it wants to tell you something becomes impure in the sense that it could still pass on to something else, we're going to call it litameh, to make impure. When we say disqualified, we mean that's the end of it. This is disqualified, but it doesn't pass on impurity to anything else. So we brought a source for Rabbi Yosi, okay? And here I'll pull up the study guide so you can see this. Inside, we now have, let's go up to the beginning of the chart. We had our vachomer of the Revi B'Kodesh. What did he say? A mechusar kippurim, a person waiting to bring a sacrifice on day number 8. He's already done with tefillah and the mikvah. He goes to the mikvah. He waits for the sun to set, or she waits for the sun to set. They're now permitted to eat truma at night. But they're waiting till the next day, till they bring their sacrifice. Until they bring their sacrifice, they're pasul b'kodesh. They can't eat sacrificial anything. So if they're permitted b'truma, but pasul b'kodesh, a shlishi l'tuma, which is pasul b'truma, right? In other words, anything that came in contact with a sheni that's truma is going to be disqualified as truma. Eino dinu she'aseh revi b'kodesh. Won't that make a revi? Because if something's, again, it's the exact same vachomer we had before for the shlishi, which is if something's permitted and yet forbidden, then something else forbidden is going to be forbidden also. We already pointed out yesterday, it's not exactly a fair vachomer because the mechusar kippurim is a person who's waiting for something and he can or can't eat truma is the issue, whereas the shlishi is an object that was disqualified for truma. It's not exactly a clear comparison, but we're going to go with it. Rabbi Yochanan now says, I can knock out your vachomer from a different vachomer that's going to basically, say, if you want to say this is that and that's that, well, I'm going to give you a different one. Food that comes in contact with a tful yom, which, if you remember, we had a 3-way machloket about it. The rabbis said that the impurity that a tful yom carries is that the person is a sheni after they went to the mikvah before the sunset, but they can only pass on shlishi and not revi, okay? For whatever, right? That's the way the rabbis decided it was going to be. So we had a case where something disqualifies at a level of a shlishi, of truma, and it doesn't go to a 4th level of revi b'kodesh. So there you have proof that just because something's pasul b'truma doesn't mean it goes on to be a revi, like you tried to say. So to which we left with this question that Rav Papa asked and said, you're assuming when you questioned Rabbi Yosi, that Rabbi Yosi holds by the rabbis in this 3-way machloket. But why don't you say that he holds like Abba Shaul? Because what does Abba Shaul say? The food that a full yom came in contact with, l'tamei sheni v'lifsol echad, which means it's a rishon, which passes on tuma, l'tamei shnayim, 2 dargot, sheni to shlishi, and lifsol echad to even revi. It will disqualify the 4th. So then basically that answers Rabbi Yochanan's question. So why don't we say that? And that's where we ended yesterday. I'm going to start in the Gemara now and say the following. Isal kadata 5 lines from the bottom of Kaftet Amud. If you want to say, to answer this question of Rabbi Yochanan, what we're basically going to try to do, just to give you the structure, we're going to try to say that maybe Rabbi Yosi holds like Abba Shaul, in which case Rabbi Yochanan's question falls aside, because that's the details that Rabbi Yochanan used don't match Abba Shaul's opinion, because the whole thing of Rabbi Yochanan was that Ochel Haba Machmat Tful Yom can't make a revi, and Abba Shaul says it does make a revi. We're going to try to say, maybe he holds like Abba Shaul, and that would answer the question. In the end, we're not going to be able to answer the question. We're going to say it's clear that Rabbi Yosi does not hold like Abba Shaul. Okay, and it's going to take us a few stages, but that's basically, we're going to start saying it, then we'll try to say maybe still, and then we're going to reject that also. And in the end, we're going to say he doesn't hold like Abba Shaul, and we're going to be left with Rabbi Yochanan's question on Rabbi Yosi. So they say the following: if he held like Abba Shaul, then he would have brought a simpler vachomer, not this mechusar kippurim. In other words, we're basically going to say that Rabbi Yosi clearly doesn't hold by Abba Shaul, because if he did, he would have given a much simpler vachomer. What would it have been? Uma ochel haba machmat tful yom. Okay, remember, this is Abba Shaul. What happens with ochel haba machmat tful yom? It's a sheni, which goes to a shlishi, which goes to a revi. Now, what is he trying to prove, Rabbi Yosi? How do we know there's revi b'kodesh? So he could prove it from a tful yom, because he would say the following, right? It would be so clear, it wouldn't even be a vachomer, it would just be obvious. Ma ochel haba machmat tful yom, de tful yom gufe mutar b'chulin. Here he's going to say the following. Ochel haba machmat tful yom means I'm a tful yom. I went to the mikveh in the morning. I'm waiting for the sun to set. I touch food, right? That food, according to Rabbi Abba Shaul, becomes a rishon. And then that food transfers to a sheni, right? And all that. Now, comes the following and says, listen, if a tvul yom myself is mutter b'chulin. While I'm a tvul yom, we already learned that. I can eat chulin, I can even eat maser sheni, right? So if we have the ochel haba machmat tvul yom, the tvul yom gufei mutar b'chulin, I can even myself eat chulin, but food and maser sheni, but food that I touched, amart oseh revi'i b'kodesh, but the food I touched can transfer impurity all the way to fourth level impurity. So ochel shlishi haba machmat sheni. Therefore, a person who's a shlishi, or a food that's a shlishi, that became a shlishi because of a sheni, the sheni gufei asur b'chulin, because the sheni itself was forbidden to chulin. Again, this is the same weird comparison. Sheni food is, right, chulin food can become a sheni. And it's, right, so now, again, here's our kal and here's our chamor. Our kal is the tvul yom, which himself can eat chulin, or herself can eat chulin. A sheni is forbidden when it comes to chulin food. Chulin food that's a sheni is pasul. So if sheni gufei asur b'chulin, and if the tvul yom, the food that comes from the tvul yom can make a revi, then obviously this more strict halacha b'shlishi that comes from a sheni, where the sheni itself was asur b'chulin, eino din shoseh revi b'kodesh. Wouldn't it be obvious that it would pass on impurity to revi? So basically, if he held like Abba Shaul that the food that comes from a Chomat Tvul Yom can make a revi, then obviously you would say a regular shlishi can make a revi. Okay? Since he doesn't say that, we're assuming he doesn't hold like Abba Shaul. Okay? Now, the Gemara still tries to keep this going and says, wait a minute. But maybe he didn't use this vachomer of the Tvul Yom because of the following reason, something that we saw in yesterday's daf. Maybe mishum de'ikal mifrach, because you could question this and knock out this vachomer by saying, remember, we tried to say a tvul yom is kal. It's exactly what we did yesterday. Why is the tvul yom kal? Light, right? It's lenient because a tvul yom themselves are permitted to eat chulin, so that makes them lenient because they can eat even maser sheni. Now, you could say, but it has what we call a tzad chamul, but it has a strict side to it. What's the strict side? Mishum de'ikal mifrach ma l'tvul yom shekain avatuma. But you could say, you can't say a tvul yom is such a lenient halacha because a tvul yom themselves, I said myself, I'm a tvul yom. Why would I be a tvul yom? Theoretically, I could have been a nida, let's say, or a zava, which makes me an avatuma. I have some sort of strict, something that's very severe, I would say, in me, because I myself was an avatuma. Now, ochel that comes from a sheni we were talking about, right? A sheni that makes a shlishi, or a shlishi haba machmat sheni. That food was never an avatuma. So it could be that I have a certain severity about me, and that's why we're going to be strict and say I can make the food that comes that I touched can go all the way to fourth degree impurity, but maybe a shlishi that came from a sheni would not go that far of impurity because it was never an avatuma. But you can't, and then what would that say? Okay, so let's go back to our chart. That would say that the reason, remember, we tried to answer the question that Rabbi Yochanan raised because Rabbi Yochanan raised the question assuming Rabbi Yosi had like chachamim. We said maybe he had like Abba Shaul. We said no, he can't possibly have like Abba Shaul because he would have brought this vachomer. Maybe he didn't bring that vachomer because the tvul yom himself or herself could be an avatuma, which is some strict law, which means it wouldn't be able to make a vachomer. But you obviously can't say that. Why? Because what vachomer did he choose instead? Rabbi Yosi used a vachomer from a mechusar kippurim. Now, what's a mechusar kippurim? It's a zava, nida, yoledet, all these people, a mitzora, who needs to bring a sacrifice, who themselves, when they were impure, were an avatuma. So, if you're going to say that the fact that the tvul yom was potentially an avatuma, and that's why it's such a severe law, and you can't learn a vachomer, we would have questioned, right? He never would have made this vachomer from a mechusar kippurim who was also an avatuma. So that's not a good argument to explain why he didn't use this vachomer, in which case we're going to say, back to where we started, he obviously didn't use this vachomer of the ochel haba machmat tvul yom because he didn't hold like Abba Shaul, because he held like chachamim. Once he holds like chachamim, that there is no revi'i b'kodesh in the food that comes from a tvul yom, then we actually really could knock out his vachomer. And we're stuck with that question of Rabbi Yochanan on what Rabbi Yosi said. So that was section 1 for today. Okay, I'll review it now. We won't review it at the end so that you don't get too many things in your head. What we tried to do, we had this proof of Rabbi Yosi. How do you know that Revi is pasul and kodshim, right? That Shlishi can make a Revi when it comes to Kodesh. He brought a vachomer. Remember, if you remember from yesterday, Shlishi by Kodesh, we had a pasuk about. Revi, he learns by vachomer. But Rabbi Yochanan questions that vachomer, and we tried to answer it, but we were unsuccessful. Now we're moving on to part 2. Part 2 is a little long. This is the main part about Tum and Tara, and then we're going to move on from Tum and Tara and go back to our Mishnah, to the next cases in our Mishnah. Amar Rav Asi, Amar V'amrele, Amar Rabba ben Isi, Amar Rab. This section, actually, for the most part, except for one little section, is a bit simpler than the Tum and Tara we've been learning, although, or at least once we've done that, this shouldn't be as complicated. Rav is basically going to say, or someone quoted in the name of Rav, we're not sure who, was it Rabba ben Isi or Rav Asi? Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Eliezer, quotes 5 rabbis. Kulu svira lehu de ein sheni osa shlishi b'chulin. They all disagree with Rabbi Akiva in our Mishnah and say that there's no such thing as second-degree impurity passing on to third-degree impurity when it comes to non-sacred items. Okay, there is no such thing as a shlishi b'chulin when it comes to non-sacred items. Again, this is the classic halacha that we paskin about. Okay, sheni makes a shlishi only when it comes to truma and sacrificial items. Shlishi makes a revi only when it comes to sacrificial items, right? Every level drops something. So this is what, I just want to point out methodologically. This happens often where the Gemara says this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy all say the same thing. And what they do is they're now going to quote each separate source. Each one's talking about a different machloket. They're involved in some argument with someone. And usually they're minority opinions. In this case, and usually that means we don't hold like them, but we're just pointing out there's a bunch of people that hold by this minority opinion, and we see all these different machlokot, and the same thing is underlying all of them. But in this case, we actually hold the way they say. Okay, so even though maybe it looks like they're minority opinions, in the end, we're going to hold this way. So it's a little different than most of the times where it says this one and this one and this one and this one all hold the following thing. Rabbi Meir. Now we're going to go one by one, all 5 cases. Rabbi Meir, Ditnan. Okay, before we even get to the end of the sentence, let's explain what this means. Anything that needs water, like bringing water upon it, by rabbinic law. Okay, what does this mean? I'll give you the most simple example that you do in your daily life, which is washing hands before we eat bread is exactly this, bi'at mayim. We know generally you go to the mikveh if you have impurity. Going to the mikveh, how does that work? We already learned. You're a tvul yom. You have to wait for the sun to set. Now, if you had to wash your hands for bread and wait for the sun to set so you could eat the bread, right, that would be kind of annoying. You'd never be able to eat bread during the day. That's not the kind of impurity we're talking about. This is a different kind of impurity. It's divrei sofrim. It's the rabbinic, and that's why it's different. It doesn't need sunset. And it means that you need to pour water. That's why it says bi'at mayim, or put your hands in water. There's different things for different halachot. But they just need bi'at mayim. They don't need more than that. And this is, why do we wash our hands before we eat bread? Because we want to remember the truma they did in those days. And often people treated things like truma also. The rabbi said, yadayim askaniyotin. What does that mean? Our hands touch all sorts of things. We know that. Your hands are busy all day touching things. It's very likely that your hands have come in contact with impurity. Now, the rabbi said, we're going to declare that everybody's hands, since they might have touched something, are sheni l'tuma. Now you're going to understand why it's only relevant for truma. Because what? If my hands are a sheni, if they touch something, it'll turn it into a shlishi. If it's chulin, that's irrelevant because there is no shlishi. If it's truma, it's going to disqualify them. Because of the kohanim and the truma in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, we all wash our hands on a day when we eat bread because we don't want to make the bread tameh. Again, it would only be if the bread was truma, right? This is a remnant of something that was then that we keep still today to remember that halacha. Okay, so anything that needs bi'at mayim midivrei sofrim, which is what we're talking about, like for example, your hands, meaning those are considered a sheni. That's what the items that need bi'at mayim from rabbinic law. Mitameh kodesh. Here again, those words mitameh and posel. It's mitameh kodesh, which means it can make the kodesh a shlishi, which still has the ability to make something into 4th degree, right? A shlishi is 3rd degree impurity, which can pass on impurity to 4th degree impurity, because that's kodesh, that's sacrificial meat. Uposel et truma, it disqualifies truma. That's what I just said, because my hands are a sheni, right? Or anything that could be a sheni, which is what, right? Anything that needs biyat mayim from rabbinic law, by definition, is called a sheni, a second degree. And because why is that? Because the rabbis determined that. The rabbi said, if we're going to make you, we're going to say this is impure, we're going to call it, it's going to have the level of impurity of a second degree. And it's going to disqualify truma, because again, that's the end game. Disqualification means that's it. After that, shlishi touches another truma, it doesn't make it impure because there is no revi in truma. Umutar b'chulin uv'maser. Here's exactly what we're looking for. We want to see that sheni doesn't make a shlishi in chulin. It's exactly what it says. This thing that needs biyat mayim, let's just say, for example, our hands, touches a loaf of bread that's chulin or that's maser sheni, it doesn't do anything. Mutar, it's permitted. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Chachamim osrim b'maser. Chachamim disagree when it comes to maser sheni. Maser sheni is the second tithe. You bring your fruits to Jerusalem. Those have sanctity, according to the rabbis, enough sanctity that sheni could mess them up. But Rabbi Meir doesn't agree, and that's what we were looking for. Rabbi Meir holds, here's the first opinion, that sheni doesn't make a shlishi when it comes to chulin. Rabbi Yosi, second one, Rabbi Yosi is our Rabbi Yosi. What did Rabbi Yosi say? How do we know that a shlishi is mitame revi when it comes to sacrificial items? So now they say the following. So hadamaran, we don't need to quote it, we already saw it. If a sheni, now there's a certain assumption they're going to make here. If a sheni could make chulin disqualified, right, it would mess up a shlishi, chulin would become a shlishi and mess them up. Well, leite l'revi b'truma b'chamishi b'kodesh. And if truma could be passed on to chulin, okay, it's not just mess them up, because chulin, we don't really care if they get impure, okay? You're asking, is maser sheni consider chulin? It's a bit of a machloket here, how much we consider chulin, how much not. So now they say the following. If impurity could be passed on to chulin, which could then pass on to truma, which could then pass on to kodesh, right? Then we're assuming everything goes up a level. So if there's third degree impurity by chulin, by non-sacred items, then there would be fourth degree impurity by truma and fifth degree impurity by kodesh. The fact that, right, dim ite, if there was, leite l'revi b'truma b'chamishi b'kodesh, and right, everything would go up a level. And what does Rabbi Yosi say? How do we know that shlishi does a revi'i in kodesh? But he didn't say revi'i does a chamishi, right? The fourth goes to fifth. So basically, from there we infer it can't be that it's that sacred, non-sacred items could become a shlishi, because then truma would be a revi'i, kodesh would be a chamish, and that's not what Rabbi Yosi says. So Rabbi Yosi clearly doesn't hold this either. Next, Rabbi Yoshua ditnan. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, ha'ochel, okay, now this is, I like to say, you are what you eat, according to Rabbi Eliezer. What does that mean? Ha'ochel ochel rishon, if you eat ochel, food, that's a rishon l'tuma, came in contact with a zav-touched food, turned it into a rishon, and I eat that rishon, I'm a rishon right now. When I eat that food, it turns me into a rishon. By eating food, that's impure, I become impure myself. Okay, that's why I say you are what you eat, exactly. If I ate a sheni, and then I'm a sheni. If I eat a shlishi, I'm a shlishi. Okay, I am what I eat, 100%. Rabbi Yoshua, who is the one we're looking for, Omer, ha'ochel ochel rishon ve'ochel sheni. No, I'm not exactly what I eat. If I eat a rishon or I eat a sheni, I'm only a sheni. Okay. First of all, the Torah doesn't say you become tamei by eating food, right? So he says this is a different kind of tuma. We're going to say if you eat the food, you become tamei at that same level. No, it's not at that same level. You become a sheni. Whether you ate a rishon or whether you ate a sheni, you're a sheni. What if you ate a shlishi? Sheni b'kodesh ve'ein sheni b'truma. I become sheni for kodesh, meaning if I ate that shlishi, now remember, a shlishi, what's the power of a shlishi? Third degree impurity. It can only pass on fourth degree impurity to sacrificial items. So therefore, if I ate that shlishi, I become actually a sheni. I go up a level, which doesn't usually happen. This happens sometimes, like the rabbis play around with this. I go up a level. In other words, every time I teach you basic laws, Rishon makes a sheni, sheni makes a shlishi, makes a revi. There are exceptions to this rule. Okay, that's what makes it more complicated. In this case, I ate a shlishi. I become a sheni, but not to pass on to truma, because the shlishi itself wouldn't have passed on to truma. Only for kodesh. But 2 levels of kodesh I can do, meaning I can make a piece of meat. After I eat this shlishi, I now become a sheni. I can pass on impurity to another piece of sacrificial meat, which if that touches another piece of sacrificial meat, it will become a revi'i also. Okay, that's what it's saying. Now, what is this shlishi that I'm eating? So he says here, bechulin, this is the continuation. This is the important line of Rabbi Yoshua. What's the shlishi that I'm eating? It would be a case of bechulin shenasu al taharat truma. Shlishi of food would be a case where I treated my chulin as if it was truma. That's what I mentioned before. One of the reasons why we do this, netilat yadayim, even though we're not all kohanim, and it's not just a law for kohanim, because there were people in those days who treated all their items as if they were truma, even though they weren't necessarily kohanim, or maybe they were kohanim and treated everything, even their non-truma items, just so as not to make distinctions. So anyway, because the shlishi of food we're discussing would be a case where it was chulin that were treated like truma. So now the Gemara infers from him what? That it only is a shlishi if what? Al taharat truma'in. Now, Rashi changes the next few words. I'm going to go with Rashi's girsa. Okay, if you look in Rashi, it says, hey, gimel means hachi gartzin, and this is the way the Gemara should read. Al taharat truma'in chulin greda lo, but not regular chulin, because there is no such thing as a shlishi for regular chulin, because, right, ein sheni osa shlishi b'chulin. So that's why he has to tell us it's only if it were the food were chulin that you treated like truma, otherwise it wouldn't be a shlishi. So there you see Rabbi Yoshua says this as well. Alma kasavar, from there you learn, ein sheni osa shlishi b'chulin. Then a sheni can't make a shlishi into chulin. Next, we're up to number 4. Rabbi Elazar, Ditanya. Rabbi Elazar omer, shloshtan shavim. What are shloshtan? Chulin, truma, and kodesh. They're shavim in a certain way. They're obviously not all equal. But how are they similar? Harishon shebakodesh. Okay, if you have a rishon l'tuma, first degree impurity, whether that item that became impure is sacrificial meat or sacrificial anything, or truma, or chulin, okay? It's still a rishon, and it's still going to be, we're going to see what it can do. So, harishon shebakodesh v'shebachulin v'shebatruma, all 3 of those will do the following. And here we get again to that language of mitame and posel. It will be mitame shnayim. It can pass on impurity to a sheni, right, which will be chulin, and then the sheni to a shlishi if it were truma, and posel, oh, sorry, I shouldn't say, right. Right now we're talking about all b'kodesh. I didn't get to the end of the line here. Let me read the whole line and then I'll explain. Harishon shebakodesh v'chulin shebatruma mitame shnayim u'posel lacha b'kodesh. If you take one item, there was, let's say, a loaf of bread that came in contact with a zav, okay, or a vessel, doesn't matter. It could be chulin, it could be kodesh, it could be truma, it could be anything, it could be, let's say, a loaf of bread, that I was a zava, I touched it. Now, that loaf of bread passes on if, let's say, it comes in contact with sacrificial meat, sacrificial anything, it can make that a sheni, which then would touch another piece of sacrificial something, it would be a shlishi, and it would go to a revi'i and disqualify that last one. What if it's truma? Let's say it touches that first loaf of bread, which could be chulin, let's say, non-sacred, but let's say it touched truma. So it would go how many levels? 2 more, second and third. This is very simple, right? Rishon makes sheni and shlishi. Mitame echad uposel echad. So it's mitame the sheni, because that means then the sheni can be mitame 1 more level, assuming it's truma, right? And it disqualifies 1 more level after that, making a shlishi and truma. Uposel echad b'chulin. When it comes to chulin, it only goes 1 more, because that's exactly what we're looking for. This rishon touches a sheni, ruins it if it's chulin, and that's it. It doesn't go any farther. By the way, I want to point out something really important. If that chulin touches truma, right, it wouldn't become impure, because that's the end game for this chulin item. Rabbi Eliezer, okay, so that's the 4th, last one. Rabbi Eliezer ditnan. Actually, I have to check it, but I hope that's right. Maybe a sheni could. It's chulin. Actually, I'm not sure about that last line. So if truma comes in contact with a sheni that's chulin, maybe it could make it to me. Sorry, I just got confused by that issue. Okay, let's go on. Rabbi Eliezer, ditnan. Okay, this is the more complicated case, and then after this, it's very easy, the da. Rabbi Eliezer omer, chalat nitelet min haTorah al atmeah. I'm taking challah from my dough. Okay, usually what do? I have a batch of dough. By Torah law, if I'm giving it to the kohen to eat, which was what they used to do in those days, it was 1 in 24. If it became impure, which is what nowadays we assume it's all impure because we don't hold laws of impurity, you actually have to take less because it's not going to the kohen, it's going to get burnt. So you only have to take 1 in 48. Now, if I have, so once it becomes impure, I have to take less and it burns. But let's say I purposely made it impure because it didn't want it, right? Let's say for whatever reason, I purposely made it impure. We penalize me. And we say, well, we don't want to let you get away with now only giving 1 in 48, even though it has to be burned, you still have to give 1 in 24. As we say, shelo yehei chotei niskal. So that someone who purposely makes it impure, just right, maybe they're doing it just to get out of it. We're not going to let them get out of it. We're going to have to give 1 in 24. Comes Rabbi Eliezer and he says, I have a better solution. If you made your batch impure, because again, challah is sacred. So it's like truma. You can't, a kohen can't have impure truma, a kohen can't have impure challah. So it's something sacred that gets disqualified if it's impure. So now, what, and it has to be burned. That's why we burn our challah. Now, if Rabbi Eliezer says, I have a solution for you. You made your batch impure, make another batch of dough. Put the two together in a very unique manner, because if you put them together, what's going to happen? One touches the other, it's going to pass on impurity to the other. So you can't do that. So he's going to have a solution. And here it goes. He says, you could take challah from the pure batch on the impure batch, but there's a halacha that in order, you might know this, if you make 2 separate batches of dough and you want to take challah because one doesn't have enough and you want to put them together, they actually have to be touching, okay? Or covered by one thing. They have to be together. So now we want to get these two together, but we don't really want to get them together because as soon as we get them together, one's going to cause the other to be impure. So how are we going to do this? He's got a solution. Ketzad, shtei isot. We have 2 batches of dough, and I'm going to pull up the sheet here. I made a little picture at the bottom, not the greatest picture, but here we have 2 batches of dough, the impure one on the left, the pure one on the right. What are we going to do? So we have achat Torah, achat mea. Notel kedei challah mi'isa shelo hurma chalata. We take the pure batch and we take a little piece of challah out of it, enough to cover both batches. But we don't yet call it challah, okay? We leave it aside without calling it challah yet because right now the batches aren't touching. Forget this picture. Right now you just took it from one batch. So in order to do challah on the whole thing, you have to connect these. So first take it out. Then what do? Notem pachot mikibetza be'emes. You put less than the size of an egg. Now, in my picture, it's the size of an egg, and you'll see why in a minute. Later, we're going to change this. But right now, we say less than the size of an egg. Why is less than the size of an egg? You're going to take a bit, in addition to taking your challah out of the pure batch, you're going to take another piece of dough from the pure batch, a very small size, less than an egg bulk, and put it in between both batches and have the batches touching each other. What's unique about less than a kibetza? You might remember this. Less than a kibetza can't become impure. You need a certain amount to become impure. There's actually a whole machloket about this part. So there's different ways to understand the sugya depending on how you understand it. But some people think it's a kazayit and it's a kibetza to pass on impurity. But either way, we're going to just not get into that right now. You put less than a kibetza in the middle, kidei litom and amukaf, and then what are you going to do? You're going to put these 3 together. So now you have the impure batch, which is not going to make the kibetza impure because it's the one in between because it's less than a kibetza. It won't become impure. And then you've attached them all. So now nothing will happen to that other batch either. And you'll be in good shape. And then what do? You say the piece of challah I took before, you now make the bracha. You say this is challah for all of it, and you're good to go. Chachamim, turning now to Amubet, Oslim. They say you can't do this. Okay. Now, we don't yet know the reason for the machlok. Vitanya, but there's another braita that disagrees with this Mishnah and says kibetza. And that's why in my picture, I put a kibetza. Even a kibetza. Now, what will happen if it's a kibetza? So let's just go through. The isa that's impure, now we're going to say in a second, let's just read it. Savrua idi v'idi b'isa rishona. They assume, now often when we say they assumed, it means and it was a mistake, but it's not a mistake here. They assumed, and this is what everyone assumes about this, that the batch of dough that's impure is a rishon, which means what's going to happen? The kibetza, since it's a kibetza, okay, Rabbi Eliezer says you can even do this if it's a kibetza. Now, if it's a kibetza, that will become impure as well, because a kibetza does become impure. That will be a sheni. Okay, that little piece of dough will be a sheni. But what? This is our whole question. Can a sheni pass on impurity to a shlishi, right? Only if it's sanctified. Our batch of dough, is it sanctified, the pure batch? Not really. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Okay, we assume right now it's not sanctified. What's sanctified? Challah becomes sanctified. But the batch of dough that you're supposed to take challah from is not sanctified. And that's what they're going to say right now. The chulin hatvulin lechallah, if you have regular batch of dough that's supposed to take challah from it, lo kechaladamu. It's not like challah, so it's not like truma, in which case nothing will happen to that batch of dough. So all you'll do is you'll mess up this little piece of dough, but like you've sacrificed that piece of dough, so to speak. But what you've gained is the ability to take truma on this entire thing without messing up the other batch. Okay, now, what's the question now? And that would show Rabbi Eliezer that sheni doesn't make a shlishi in chulin, because otherwise that batch would be impure. So now they say the following: my lab by kamifli. So what's the machlokah Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis? Dimar savar ein sheni osa shlishi b'chulin, umar savar sheni osa shlishi b'chulin. Assuming that you hold that tahor batch, the pure batch, is not considered sanctified like truma just because you're supposed to take challah. It doesn't mean it's like challah. It's not sanctified. So then it's chulin. So then we have exactly our case. Rishon makes a sheni, which makes a shlishi. Rabbis say it makes a shlishi because sheni osa shlishi b'chulin, like Rabbi Akiva said. And Rabbi Eliezer says no. And there you have it. The Rabbi Eliezer holds, sheni doesn't osa shlishi b'chulin. But we're now going to have two other explanations. And in both explanations, everyone is going to assume, and this is charted at the end of the sheet. I'm not going to share screen, but you can look inside. Everyone's going to agree here that ein sheni osa shlishi b'chulin. And there's some other issue going on. So I'm Rav Mary Braid Rav Kana, explanation number 2. Nobody thinks the sheni makes a shlishi in chulin. What's the machloket then? Well, the assumption we assumed before is going to be actually a machloket. The question is, if you have a batch of dough you haven't taken challah yet from, but you're supposed to take challah, does that already mean it's sanctified like challah? So, Mar Savar Kechaladamu, the rabbis who say you can't do this solution is because it's already like challah, and therefore you will turn it into a shlishi, not because a sheni makes shlishi in chulin, but because it's actually like truma. And truma, there is shlishi. Umar Savar Lo Kechaladamu, and Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it's not like challah. Third option, Ibait Emer. Some people say the kule alma chulin atfulin lechala lo kechaladam. Some people say the chulin, that's right. I'm sorry, everybody says it's not chala. And everybody says ein sheni osa shlishi b'chulin, which basically would sound like Rabbi Eliezer, not a problem at all. So at this point, we think it's not a problem. It's certainly not truma. It doesn't have the status of truma. It's not like chala. It's chulin, and there's no problem to do chulin. So what's the problem now? According to this, until now, we kept thinking the problem was we're worried about making this batch of dough that's pure, impure. But now we're going to say the whole problem is that little middle piece in the middle. That's what's bothering us, okay? Because no way, no how, not according to the rabbis, not according to Rabbi Eliezer. Is it Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Elazar? Let me just check so I don't confuse it. It's Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. According to Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, definitely no impurity is passing to that pure dough because it's not truma and there's no shlishi in chul. However, what's the problem? Can you take even a little small piece of dough and can you make something impure on purpose in Israel? Okay, outside of Israel, it's not a problem because, well, it is a problem, but everything is, remember, everybody's impure outside of Israel, so you're doing that all the time. The question is, can you, and this is a good question, we talked about before that, chulin can become tameh at a level of a sheni. Is it a problem to make chulin tameh? I understand it's a problem to make truma tameh. It disqualifies that you have to burn it, or challah tameh. But is it a problem to make chulin tameh? So what? It becomes impure. You just have to deal with it and keep it away from, things that, will be problematic for it. I guess it must be wrong that really a chulin could pass on impurity to a shlishi, right? To truma. I'm sure what I said before was not correct. If it's chulin, I got confused because it did say posel b'chulin, but it doesn't mean posel, it's the end game. It really would pass on, a sheni could pass on impurity to truma. So keep it away from truma, let's say. So anyway, their machloket is, marsavar mutar ligrom tuma l'chulin sheberetz Yisrael. Rabbi Eliezer says, do the solution because we don't care. So what? You sacrifice this little piece of dough in order to be able to give the kohen a loaf of bread. We don't care that maybe there's an issue in general, but when there's some important motivation to do it, we're allowed to. And the rabbis who don't allow this, you can't intentionally pass tuma on to gebetza. So that's why the rabbis basically say in this situation, you have no choice. You can't make this little piece into a sheni, even if it won't pass on impurity to this other batch of dough, and theoretically it could resolve your issue, but you can't. It's like the ends doesn't justify the means. You can't Bimatame something just so that you can resolve some other issue. No, take your truma 1 and 24, take your challah, your 1 and 24, and burn it, and don't give it to the kohen. There's nothing we could do. Okay, that's the machloket between them. And with that, we got to the 5. Okay, so summarizing this section, 5 rabbis, each in different sources and different topics, but all of them indicate, right, say that sheni doesn't make a shlishi in chulin. That was the second section for today. Third section. Bo bayom darash Rabbi Akiva. If you remember the psukim about the Levite cities, and is the 2,000 amma referring to the Levite cities, or is it just really teaching us about Tchum Shabbat? And Rabbi Akiva says it's just teaching us about Tchum Shabbat. Tchum Shabbat is 2,000 cubits, meaning you can't, on Shabbat, a person is allowed to walk up to 2,000 cubits outside their city. Once they go past 2,000 cubits, it's forbidden by Torah law. So, but my kamiflage, and the other opinion says, no, the 2,000 cubits is coming for something else entirely, for the Levite cities, not having to do with Tchum Shabbat. So what's the machloket between them? Mar savar tchumen deoraita, mar savar derabanan. This machloket is tchumen deoraita or is tchumen derabanan, and it's learned out from here. Now, it's also learned out from a different, really the rules are learned out from here, but the measurement of how far Tchum Shabbat is, according to Rabbi Akiva, but it also says, al tetzei ish mimkomo. Al yetzei ish mimkomo, and it's learned out from there in Masechet Eruvin, if you remember. Don't leave your place. Now, those who hold tchumen is deoraita say that pasuk is talking about Tchum Shabbat. Other people would have to say it's talking about something else. And the 2,000 comes to say how much. The other opinion says no. And then we talked about this the other day, although I'll clarify. I got a little confused with the Yubet Meal. I was just, as I was saying it wasn't clear in my head. But let me clarify it now. Those who say it's D'Rabbanan, there's a split. The Rambam holds it's not fully D'Rabbanan. It is D'Oraita. It has its source in the Torah. But it's a much larger distance that you can go according to Torah. Yubet Meal is a much larger distance. You can go much farther on Shabbat, but the rabbis made it 2,000 cubits. Comes the other rabbis, like the Ramban and others, who disagree with the Rambam and say, no. Those who hold Tchumen D'Rabbanan think that the whole concept of Tchum Shabbat is only rabbinic. Okay, it's a big machloket, and it's a big machloket how to understand the machloket. Is there any kind of Tchum Shabbat in the Torah, or is the entire thing a rabbinic, a rabbinic initiative? Okay, so that was section 4, very short section. Now we're going to get to a bit of a longer section, but very, very simple. Now it's about going back to Shirat Hayam. How did they sing at Yam Suf when they split the Red Sea? Az Yashir Moshe B'nai Israel, right? Moshe and B'nai Israel sung. And then it says Vayomru Lemor. Why does it say Vayomru Lemor? That seems unnecessary words. So Tanu Rabbanan, Bo Bayom Darash Rabbi Akiva, B'Sha'a Shalu. We're now going to have a braita with 3 opinions. B'Sha'a Shalu Yisrael Minayam Natnu Enehem Lomar Shira. They wanted to do Shira, according to Rabbi Akiva, right? They saw what happened. They said, we're going to sing to God, praise God. V'Ketzad Amru Shira. How did they do it? Tigadol HaMakrei Talel V'Hem Onim Acharav Rashi Prakim. This we saw in the Mishnah. Right, like a gadol, like an older person who reads the Hallel and the Chazan, and what does everybody do? They answer after him the chorus only, right? Moshe Amar Ashir El Hashem, v'hem omrim Ashir El Hashem. Moshe Amar Ki Ga'oga, v'hem omrim Ashir El Hashem. After everything Moshe says, they say Ashir El Hashem. Rabbi Eliezer ben Osher Rabbi Yosi ben Aglili Omer, second opinion, Ki Katan HaMakrei Hallel, v'hem onim acharav kol ma shu omer. If a minor reads Hallel in shul, like he's the Chazan, well, he can't make other people fulfill their obligation. So they have to say all the words after. So let's say they don't know the words. So he says the words, but they repeat all the words that he says. And that's what happened at the Yam. Moshe amar Ashir El Hashem, hem omrim Ashir El Hashem. Moshe amar ki ga'oga, Moshe said ki ga'oga, hem omrim, they answer ki ga'oga, and they just repeat after him. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, and we saw this opinion in the Mishnah as well, Kesofer pores al shma bebeit hakneset. It's like the way they would say Shema in shul, which is what? Hu potech tchila. He starts, right? Baruch et Hashem mevorach, and then Heim onim acharav, and then they answer, and then they continue together, right? The rest of it gets recited all together. So b'may kamiflige, what's the root of the machlok? Rabbi Akiva savar lemor amilta kamaita. When it says vayomru lemor ashir el Hashem ki ga'oga, it means they said, it only refers to the next 2 words, ashir el Hashem. So everything they said was the next 2 words, Ashir El Hashem, and they constantly repeated that. Rabbi Eliezer ben Osher Rabbi Yosi Glili Omer Lemor Akol Milto Milta. The words when it says Vayomru Lemor, it means, and they continue to say everything that comes from then on in, meaning they said all the words by recitation. Rabbi Nechemias Tavar, Vayomru Damar Kulu Ba'adad. Lemor, he says there's two words here. Vayomer means they said every word together. Lemor means Depatach Moshe Bereisha. Lemor says, well, Moshe started them off, but then everything else was said together. And that's how we have the basis for the three opinions. And with this, we're going to end with one interesting, beautiful image, even though it's obviously a huge exaggeration and can't possibly be true. And you can listen to Rabbanit Yifi Clymer, whose shiur this week on Second Thought is all about this topic. Tanu Rabbanan, Tarash Rabbi Yosi Aglili, B'sha'ah shalu Yisrael min hayam nanu enehem lomar shira. So Rabbi Yosi Aglili says, across the splitting of the sea, they all wanted to sing to God. Ketzad amru shira, how did they do it? Well, not only did the grown-ups say shira, and not only did the kids say shira, but olal mutal arbrikeimo, a little tiny baby that's in his mother's lap, vitinok yonek mishte imo, and the babies who were nursing, as soon as they all saw the Shekhinah, what they're trying to say is how great this miracle was. Even these little babies who don't understand anything, we're in the middle of nursing even, they were distracted by nursing. They saw the Shekhinah, what did they do? So the one lying on his mother's lap picked up his neck. Tinok shamat dad mipiv, the tinok came off his mother's breast. When they started singing, wow, this is our God, and we should adorn him, right? We should make him beautiful. Shenemar, how do we know this? It's a pasuk in Tehillim that they darshan. Mipi olalim biyomkim yisad ta'os. Right? You established your strength from the mouths of the babies and the children. And this is the topic of On Second Thoughts. You could go into it there. Tomorrow, we'll start with not only did the babies, even the fetuses. Obviously, these are extreme, exaggerated stories, but they're trying to get to this beautiful idea of how amazing the miracle was and how it was noticed by everybody. So we talked about the different ways the Shira was done, 3 different models. And then we talked, right, darshaning the psukim by Yomru Lemol. And then we had this idea about all the kids praising God at the splitting of the sea. That I will wish you all Shabbat Shalom. And moving on to new topics, we're finished with the laws of impurity. Reminds us of those Dapim in Shabbat, if you remember. And that's it for today. Have a great day, everyone.